Amen. All right. I'd like you to start by casting your mind back 12 months. Does anybody know what we were doing 12 months ago? I'd especially like to ask our Fijian members, what were you doing 12 months ago? What is it? It's September 18. Well, we were just about to start.
Camp meeting at Nyala.
Camp meeting at Nyala, yes. Our first virtual camp meeting. We've come a long way since our use of the technology. So the Fijian members held a camp meeting. TMW were able to assist with the link up with the Zoom, but we had our first virtual camp meeting. The members there were able to meet in person, which was the last time before COVID, but that's where we were. So I thought, basically for my benefit, I've gone back to review those studies that were done for that camp meeting. So if you take your minds back again to September last year, what was on all our minds in September last year? What were we thinking about? What we were obsessed with? What's coming?
November 9. Close of probation for the priests. Is that what you're thinking of? Oh, that's last year. That was the year before. Sorry.
Last year?
Don't mind me. Yeah, sorry.
That would have been late.
Yeah.
And Ray's told us on the chat, it's the US election.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Because what had we been teaching, Lynn? What was our message?
Well, previously we'd been teaching that Trump was the last president, and but then I believe that started to change, though, as far as what was being taught. I think the elders realised that wasn't necessarily the case.
So this is like it's been developing over a period of time in understanding personalities versus what those personalities represent. And this got tackled pretty clearly at this particular camp meeting. So we're going to go back there. But first of all, in the lead up to that camp meeting, Elder Tess did a presentation leading up to the camp meeting. And I just want to touch on a few things that she brought up there, because she took us to our lines, which I've drawn up on the board, because we're the Omega of modern Israel. And she overlaid these waymarks with the waymarks of the Omega of ancient Israel. So before just to start, if we were to overlay these lines with these waymarks with dates, what would we place for 1989? The Omega of ancient Israel.
For BC.
4 BC.
4 BC. Yeah. All right, -4. And 9/11?
27.
27 AD.
Okay. I like easiest first. Let's go down to the second advent. What's the date for the second advent?
100 AD.
100 AD.
100. What was their close of probation?
70.
70 AD.
70 AD.
70.
Mm.
70 AD.
And their Sunday law?
34 AD.
34 AD.
34. So that's on the big line of the line of Christ. But if we come down and we look at their fractals and we look at the priests of that time, what were the waymarks we would have placed after 27? What would have been their 14, 19 and 21? The next waymark after Christ's baptism.
31 AD.
So this is the line of the priests in that history.
Death of John, 28 AD.
So Jesus is baptized. What's the first thing he's going to do?
Goes to the wilderness.
Oh, true. Okay. Keep going.
First
Uh,
temple
then he-
cleansing.
That was
First
first temple
temple.
cleansing.
First
I
temple
was just going to say
cleansing.
that's the next thing.
First temple cleansing. So 19 would have
31
been
AD.
close of probation for the priests.
81 AD.
31.
And then here at the second advent. What would have been their Panium? Pentecost, thank you, Ronnie.
Pentecost.
So Pentecost. So this would have been the cross.
Yeah.
Okay, and then of course, if we come down to the next group they're called at Pentecost. And then their second advent would have been 34. And then the world is called in from 34 onwards, they start getting harvested. Okay, so in that omega of ancient Israel, we see that there are two calls for the church, church, world, because the church is in a mess and the church has to be cleansed first, hence a first temple cleansing. God has to fix his temple first before he can take the message to the world. So what were the issues in that time for God's people? What did they get wrong? What didn't they understand? And there's two things.
Kingdom of God.
The nature
They
of the
didn't
king and
understand the nature of the king and the nature of the kingdom.
of the kingdom.
Yes. So I want to suggest that that's the one same thing, because if we go back to Daniel 2, a king is a kingdom and a kingdom is a king. They're synonymous. So they didn't understand the nature of God, therefore they made him in their own image, hence the apis bull. And their kingdom, the way they ran their movement, their church, their organization, mimicked the way that they saw God. So king and kingdom, they both misunderstood both of those. That's half the problem. That's the internal problem. What's the other half of the problem? What else didn't they understand? And Brendan's put in the chat, external events. They didn't understand how they were meant to be organized, and they didn't understand God's character. That's internal, but they didn't understand external events. They didn't understand the role of Rome. Even though they were literal glorious land, they were Palestine, they were, they were actually on that literal soil. They didn't understand their relationship to the fourth kingdom and Rome and its purpose. And so if we go back to here, minus 4 BC, what do we mark? An increase of knowledge. An increase in knowledge of what? What's got to happen here? Where's their increase of knowledge going to come from?
A message.
Message from where?
John the Baptist.
Talking about, yeah.
John the Baptist is like getting breastfed. What happens time of the end?
Angels.
Birth of Christ.
Yes. Time of the end, something gets unsealed.
Daniel.
First angel.
Daniel.
First angel message.
Daniel is unsealed. There's an unsealing of Daniel. God doesn't wait until 1798 to unseal Daniel. Daniel gets unsealed and sealed up in various times of history. This was an era. Remember, Jesus said, whosoever readeth Daniel, let him understand. Therefore, Daniel was unsealed. Daniel's unsealed here at the time of the end. There's an increase of knowledge in the book of Daniel. And if you go back to Daniel 9, what's Daniel 9 going to tell you about? Look at Daniel 9, 26, 27. It's going to tell you about the king and the kingdom and Rome. Go back into Daniel 9, Daniel 11. Yep, the 70 weeks. 70 weeks involves not just internal, but external. So they were meant to understand Rome. They did not understand external events. And so when we go along these waymarks, all of these waymarks not only represent internal events, but they also represent external events and a relationship to Rome. So we know that yes, so we know that that's really what tripped them up, that this was their crucial failure, not understanding what was meant, king and kingdom, but also not understanding external events. They failed in internal and external events. So when you think of where are we, we're here. SDAs are here. And they don't know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has no idea what's happened before. They're not aware of what these waymarks have meant, that they're even waymarks, and they're obsessed with this waymark. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church is in the same position as ancient Israel. We're on the verge of Pentecost, of bringing in the second group in the church, and the church has no idea, any sort of visibility of where they are in history. They don't understand external events. They also don't understand the king and the kingdom. So what we want to look at, what was discussed at the camp meeting 12 months ago, was the alpha of modern Israel. So as we look at this board work, which is it's the Amiga history of ancient and modern Israel, what are we going to change when we redraw this to make the alpha of modern Israel? What don't they have that the Omegas have, the end has?
They don't have two groups to go to.
Thank you, Sandy. They don't have two calls to the church. And why is that? It's because they are the beginning of the church. It's in construction, and there's nothing really to get fixed at this point. It's just beginning. So there's only one call, just like in the alpha of modern Israel, alpha of ancient Israel, when there was only one exodus out of Egypt. So with modern Israel in the alpha history, in the beginning, there's only one call out of apostate Protestantism. So we're not going to have church world, we're going to have church world, which means what happens to these waymarks? If there is no first group that has to go to a second group, then the first group goes all the way through to the Sunday law. So we're going to draw it up differently. So I've drawn up the alpha of modern Israel, and we've only got two fractals or two shadows of our main line. And we understand that they're fractals, they're shadows. All these waymarks don't have all the particularities, the detail that's in the main line, but there's enough of a body of a template or an outline in these events that we can mark them the same as our line of 144,000. So I'm going to write the 144,000 here. This line, it's not priests or Levites. What would we call this first line? Sorry, the second line. First group.
Church.
Church. I'll call them Millerites, but you're right, the church. And this is, I guess, if we call this the world, we should call that the church, but this line is the world. And so what are our waymarks? So when it comes to the Millerites, Ellen White said that God stretched forth his hand a second time to gather his people. So we understand that the Millerites were scattered at some point, and then they're going to start a gathering process. They're going to gather in the world. That starts happening in 1850. I'll put 61 here. And what are our other markers here on the Millerite line? What's this one? When do they get scattered? (1844), you're going to have to be a bit more detailed.
October 1844.
October 22, thank you, Salai, 1844. Because this is when they're harvested. It's a time of trouble. It's their scattering. Then they're going to, with the aid of the 1850 chart, they were supposed to, God would have stretched forth his hand a second time to do the gathering in this time period. Okay, and then this waymark. July 21. Why July 21? 1844.
Midway.
Midway. Midway or midnight, which is a marker of the Sunday law. And what happened on July 21, 1844? Why do we even mark it? What happened? Where were they?
Was that the Boston camp meeting?
They're at the Boston. Thank you, Lynn. Boston. Then Concord's not long after, then Exeter, and then their test. So that's the line of the Millerites and their internal events. 1850, they went into the Laodicean condition. So that's why it's a line of failure. But these are internal events. So what two things do they need to understand? The nature of the king and the kingdom, and what else would they have needed to understand? External events. So each of these waymarks also represent external events, because if we look at the line of the world, they got no idea about July 21, 1844. They didn't get that invitation. They didn't get that memo to go to that camp meeting. That means nothing to them. So 1844, yes, that's an external event, but in an understanding of Islam, but what else is it in the world? Why would we mark it on the line of the world? What's important about this year?
I think it was an election.
It's an election, thank you. And then 1844 is an election. And we'll be talking about 1850 because we have the Fugitive Slave Act. So on this line, it's what would have been Sunday law, and it would begin the harvest of the world using the 1850 chart. So all this was accomplished, the internal work was accomplished using the 1843 chart. The external work would have been using the 1850 chart. And, you know, I've been around a little while. And so for many years, never ever gave any thought to there being external events of any consequence in the Millerite history. This is a relatively, other than, I guess, 1840 and 1798, they kind of had external events, and then we kind of lost focus on anything that was significant afterwards. So it's behooved on us to go back and not only understand what happened internally, which the movement has spent a lot of time on in the past, but understand the external events. So what marks 1850? I think I've already said it.
Yeah,
The Fugitive Slave Act. And what's notable about the Fugitive Slave Act? What was it about that act?
North. The people who escaped from the south, they would be taken back by the north. They have to be taken back if they escape from the south to the north.
That's it. That's exactly how it worked. The answer I'm looking for, because it was a very badly worded question, is in the chat, and it's compromise.
Yeah.
No, Brenda.
Compromise was the sin of the North. We tend to think that the South are the baddies in all of this, but the sin lie at the door of the North in this history. So we're going to go back and review this history and see how they got to this Sunday law crisis. Okay, so where are we standing? We're standing here.
Mhm.
The Great Compromise is just before us, and the Millerites were standing here. They had no visibility of external events because Miller never ever thought, he said there wouldn't be an election because the real ruler was coming. So they're not taking any notice of what's happening in the country or around the world. But it's a very, very intense time. All these presidential elections, it's actually been a tense decade. From 1840 to 1863, there would have been 6 presidential elections. Does anybody remember how many actual presidents they had between 1840 and 1863? Anybody remember? No, not 4. Remember, there was a hint. And the hint is here. Because what is this in our what is this in our, this is 9, 11. So it's got 6 presidential elections. I'll read them out to you. Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin, can't read my own writing, Pierce, James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln. 9 US presidents in 6 elections.
Mm.
And it's because twice a president died in office, got replaced by his vice president who became president, and then they held another election. So you can see that this is a really momentous time in US politics. And they mark 1844 as a turning point in US political history. So it's of very significant. All right, so we want to understand this compromise. We want to understand this compromise. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into this history, but I'm going to go pre-1798. So I might just draw that here. We'll mark 1798. And we're going to go back to 1777 and start marking the progression in history that leads us to this crisis here. So actually going to go back to 1776. What does 1776 mark?
That's the Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence. So there are 13 colonies on the continent, and they've decided to make themselves independent of Britain. And so we're in the middle of a war, and they're just going to declare it. They're going to declare themselves independent. And they do that. And then they've got to have some form of government, because now what do? You've got 13 colonies. They need to create a government that's going to run this new country. So each colony selects some delegates, and this body of delegates is created, and it's called the Continental Congress. And this Congress comes together and they write up another paper called the Articles of Confederation. So this is 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. 1777, and they've now got their Articles of Confederation. I'll write it down here. Articles of Confederation. And I just want to take you, I'm going to share screen. To the Declaration of Independence. Everybody can read that. And this is, like I said, they're just declaring themselves independent. And we'll just read the first paragraph just to familiarise ourselves with it. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, that is, we're disconnecting from England, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So what they're going to do in this document is declare why they've left Britain. And if we scroll down, can you see something that gets repeated over and over again? If you cast your eye down, what's the one word that gets repeated? Anything stand out to you?
Laws.
I want to, what's a word? It's only a little one.
Yeah.
Monarchy. They don't want monarchy.
Legislative.
It's a little word.
He.
He. Can you see that all the way down? There's a lot of he's. Who's the he? If we go back up here, it says the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He did this, he did that, he. And they actually cut it down. The original draft had 200 he's. There was a long list of grievances, and they cut it down to, I don't know, however many these are. And so what aren't they happy with? What aren't they not going to do when they start a new government?
Have a king.
No monarchy.
No king, but they don't even put in a president. There is no executive power. They're so scared of putting an executive power in that they just, they've had enough of Britain. So these Articles of Confederation, there's no executive power. There's no judicial power. So there's no courts really to oversee the laws. What they have is just one Congress, and each state has one representative in that Congress. So they've got no power. There's a lot of reasons why this document was flawed, and things just weren't working out. So 10 years later, they decide this just isn't working. So in 1777, they write the Articles of Confederation. And then in 1787, each state, bar one, is going to send delegates, some send more than others, to Philadelphia to try and fix these Articles of Confederation. And when they arrive in Philadelphia, they do three things. First of all, they decide we can't amend these, and they ditch them. They scrap it and start again. The second thing they do is they decide that each state will have one vote, regardless of how many delegates they've sent. Every state only has one vote. And the third thing they do is say, let's keep it all secret. So nobody knows what those delegates are doing. They all think, everybody back in the States thinks that they're just amending the Articles of Confederation. That's what they've gone there for. And they turn up and go, yeah, just not possible. Let's start again. So they agree that it's to be kept secret for 30 years. Nobody knows what they were to be doing, but they're going to find out sooner. And what they do is they argue a lot. Over 4 months, they just argue and argue. You've got 13 states. Some have large populations, some have small populations, and they're not coming to much of an agreement on anything. So they know they've got to start again. There was a few things actually they got right with that Articles of Confederation. They did do some good things, but it's really powerless. So what are they going to have to do? These 13 states with different interests have come together. What do they have to do to actually make it work? What would anybody have to do? What's our word?
Compromise.
Compromise. They have to compromise. There are 5 major compromises that they have to do. Compromising is when you balance interests and you have to give a little in order to get a lot. And this is what's embedded in the Constitution that they're about to write. It is a constitution of compromises, and there are 5 of them. So the first one is, it's called, what happened was James Madison, he's from Virginia, big state, large population. He's a fan of a French Enlightenment philosopher called Montesquieu, who had written about having 3 branches of government. These 3 branches would make sure that there's a check and balance in the government, that you know, if you had these 3 branches, you couldn't have you know, a dictator, you wouldn't have a king situation, and you would have representative government. So James Madison, he comes with the Virginia plan, and he says, okay, 3 branches, the ones that we're familiar with, judicial, legislative and executive. And he said the judicial would be bicameral. Bicameral means 2 chambers, Senate, House and Representatives, and they would have equal, the representatives there would be based on population of each state. Little states, they are, So you got New Jersey's a little state. He says, no, 3 branches, but we have equal representative in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So the argument is either do we base our representation on population, or do we make it equal across all the states? And along comes Connecticut and says, let's do both. And this is called the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise of the Constitution is that the Senate is determined via equal, so each state has equal representatives in the Senate, and the House of Representatives is based on population. And so they came to that compromise. All good. So one thing we need to understand about compromises is compromises are needed. You don't get any further without them, but they always mean you have to give up something. So there are, you know, kind of good compromises, kind of, you know, and then you have bad compromises. So this is called the Great Compromise. The second compromise, so maybe I should write a list. Okay, first one, the Great Compromise. That's having 3 branches, and the judicial branch is decided using 2 different ways, equal representation and population based. The second, okay, you've got big states, little states, but then you've got southern states with big populations. And what makes those populations large in the South? Slaves. So the South is rubbing their hands, Southern interests are rubbing their hands and saying, oh, that's good because we've got a large population. And the North are going, no, that's not good. So what compromise do they come to regarding all the slaves in the South? What is that known as?
The 3/5.
The 3/5 compromise.
3/5, good. Yeah.
Which basically says we will count 3 out of every 5 of your slaves as a free person. Now, when they get to this decision, what becomes evident to the framers of the Constitution is this really isn't an argument about big states and little states. What started off where they thought this was just about large populations versus small populations, what they realized is our main division is between free states and slave states. And that's going to set the course for the rest of this history. Okay, the third compromise regards commerce. The The northern states are largely industrial. They make goods. The southern states are agrarian. You know, they sell their raw goods. And so what the northern, and of course, and where do they buy their manufactured goods? Where are the South buying their manufactured goods? Not from the North. They're importing from Britain, from France. And the North are saying, you should be buying our stuff. We need tariffs on imports. And we'd also like tariffs on exporting raw goods, like cotton. And the South says, that's not fair. So they come to this compromise, and they do put import tariffs on. And now this new federal government's going to have the power to regulate trade between the states. Because what's been happening is each state has had a trade agreement with different countries overseas, and that's just not tenable. France does not want a trade agreement with each 13 states. Let's have a trade agreement with the whole country. So the Constitution comes to a compromise on this, and they agree on tariffs on imports, no tariffs on exports, and there was a few other things too, but this is one of the compromises they had. Might add that this compromise on commerce, it was a win really for the South, and the 3/5 compromise was a win for the South as well. So they're not really even, they don't work out too evenly. Okay, 4, slave trade. These delegates are made up of all different types of people. So you've got delegates that are against slavery. You got there's 55 delegates, and half of them own slaves. And then you've got others that actually want slavery embedded into the Constitution as far as protecting. They want it protected by the Constitution. So you've got all this argument going on. So they come to a compromise on the slave trade. And the compromise is, we're not going to touch the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years. And so importing slaves doesn't get stopped until 1808. I think it's 1808. They make the law in 1807. It comes into effect 1st of January 1808. And that is also a win for the South. It's a compromise. It will be banned, but just not yet. Anybody got any ideas what the 5th major compromise of the Constitution was? And I've run out, I'll put 5 up here. To do with how we're going to elect our president, because they're divided. Some are saying we need a popular vote. Others are saying you can't trust normal people with making such an informed decision. So they come to a compromise. That compromise is called what? The Electoral College.
Electoral College.
The Electoral College. So 5 major compromises to bring in the Constitution. It is a constitutional compromise. They'd still be sitting there arguing if they didn't compromise. So that's not the end of it. Now they've got to go back to the states and said, oh, guess what, guys? We threw out the Articles of Confederation and started again. Can you have a look at this new document? Well, not all the people were happy about that. So you got half the people that are like, oh yeah, sounds good to me. The other half, not happy at all. They're anti-federalists. They don't want big government. Anti-federalists are usually, they're worried that big government will take away freedoms. They feel that the states are at the best position to protect their freedoms. They're fearful of big government. Federalists tend to be more the elites, city people, for wealthy people. So you've got this, it goes for 12 months, these debates across the 13 colonies over whether they would vote for the Constitution or not. So each state has to vote. They need a majority of 9 out of the 13 to ratify the Constitution. And yeah, the debates just went for 12 months and then they had to vote. Now the Anti-Federalists, because they're worried about losing their freedom, they said, well, where's the Bill of Rights in this? Because each state also had their Constitution, but they also had a Bill of Rights. So James Madison, he said to them, look, the Constitution isn't perfect, but can you vote for it anyway? The framers understood it wasn't perfect. So anyway, it gets ratified, gets voted in, and then afterwards they bring in the first 10 amendments, or the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is actually a compromise to for the Anti-Federalists to vote for the Constitution. So it's not listed as a constitutional compromise because it was written after the Constitution was ratified, but it was a compromise document. There was actually 200 amendments offered to be, to be changed, but they didn't. They just chose 10. They chose 10 out of 200, and that was part of the compromise. So even the Bill of Rights was a compromise. Okay, so that brings us up to 1798. 1798, and what's happening? There's a ship is going to sail, and that ship is both the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or the beginnings of, and the United States. So there's been a lot going on to get us to this point. And we understand 1798 to be an increase of knowledge for God's people, for the church. The book of Daniel is unsealed. So if the book of Daniel is unsealed, they should be getting an increase of information on 2 things. The king and the kingdom, because they're the same thing, the nature of the king and the nature of the kingdom, and also on external events. But yeah, it's just going to go a little pear-shaped. So this ship is set sail. 1798, external events. What have we got?
French Revolution.
French Revolution? When was the French Revolution? What about the French Revolution? What were the dates for the French Revolution? Somebody else said something else? I didn't catch the... Lynn, did you say something?
I said French Revolution as well.
Oh, okay.
I know it wasn't exactly on that date. It was prior to, but I can't just recall the actual dates. I should, but I can't.
US.
What do we mark? Sorry, say again?
Yeah.
Recognition of United States as a government.
Yes, United States did get recognised as a government. It sent ambassadors. It sent ambassadors to where? France. Yes. So yes, Oni's put on the chat, French Revolution 1789. So 1798 in France, what's happening regarding France?
Wasn't Robespierre involved in regards to, didn't somebody from America take on some of the things that they were doing in France, and something through Robespierre or something, that obviously it's a bit vague, but anyway, so they were basically adopting some of the ideas from France when they were developing their constitution or their ideas for their constitution.
Well, Jefferson was a friend of Robespierre. I think that's correct. But the ideas that they got, like Montesquieu and yeah, they were French philosophers, and so that they borrowed, like you know, the three branches, etc.
Okay.
So yeah, those ideas
was,
were not new, but they
was
also borrowed
Lafayette.
from the Magna. Okay, so somebody's put it. Okay, so we do know that the Pope's taken captive. We're all good with that. Pope's taken captive.
Forgot that one.
What's Napoleon doing? So French Revolution's over. They got their dictator. Napoleon starts his Egyptian campaign. So, all right, Pope. And so this is Napoleon, takes the Pope captive, and he starts his Egyptian campaign. It's also actually the end of a war. So without going into too much details, there have been wars since, I think ever since there was a Frenchman and an Englishman, there've been a war on and off. If you Google them, it's just war after war after war after war. So during the French Revolution, there were actually 7 countries in Europe that fought against the French Revolution. And that particular war, it's called the War of the First Coalition, and it's got actually other titles as well. But that ends in 1798, and the War of the Second Coalition starts in 1798. So we've got to switch as far as how Europe is tackling the French problem. Okay, and now we're talking our subject, because when I ask a question, or anybody asks a question, you've got to think, well, what's our subject? What's our thread? Our thread is compromise. What are we going to mark in 1798? Who do we mark in 1798?
Seventh-day Adventist.
Yeah, that's internal. External.
America.
Who's our great compromiser?
Constitution.
Henry
Clay.
Henry Clay. Thank you,
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay, the great compromiser. So he gives his first political speech here, and he does it. He tackles 2 subjects. One is slavery, because he is against slavery, and he puts forth an argument that, this is in Kentucky, that children of slaves should be freed after a certain date. He gets rejected on that. The other topic he discusses is the Sedition Acts. We'll look at them next time. There are 4 acts that are brought into 1798 that he tackled that'll have effect on the history that's coming. But here he's tackling slavery and doesn't get very far. So before we go on and talk about Henry Clay, I want to just go over the Constitution here. And so we've seen that the Constitution is a constitution of compromise. It was built on compromise. It had to be. But it gets to a point in history, 1798, where the country is meant to progress in a certain direction. So there's things that they have to understand about this compromised document. And first thing we're going to go to is just share screen. And whoops, I got it. Sorry. So if we go back 12 months, actually August last year, just like we were looking to the next election, so was the rest of the world. And we're going to go to Barack Obama's Democratic speech for their national convention. And this was read in part at the camp meeting last year. So this was at the 2020 Democratic National Convention, and we'll just begin it. We're only going to read the first 2 paragraphs. Good evening, everybody. This is Barack Obama. As you've seen by now, this isn't a normal convention. It's not a normal time. So tonight, I want to talk as plainly as I can about the stakes in this election, because what do we do these next 76 days will echo through generations to come. So big decisions are going to be made in the next so many days. I'm in Philadelphia, where our Constitution was drafted and signed. It wasn't a perfect document, and the drafters understood it wasn't a perfect document. It allowed for the inhumanity of slavery and failed to guarantee women and even men who didn't own property the right to participate in the political process. But embedded in this document was a North Star that would guide future generations. A system of representative government, a democracy, through which we could better realise our highest ideals. Through civil war and bitter struggles, we improved this constitution to include the voices of those who'd once been left out. And gradually, we made this country more just, more equal, and more free. So what is he saying? Well, first of all, this document was not perfect, but it is a North Star. Now, it's important we understand what he means by that, because some think that a North Star is like a fixed point. It doesn't move, everything else moves, the world is turning, your life is changing, but that North Star doesn't change. That's not what he's saying here. What he's saying is the North Star is your focal point, that you know which way you're heading. And what the Constitution is showing is the way you are heading is towards more equality and more freedom. It's embedded in the Constitution, and that is the direction we're taking, not the place where we have arrived, but the direction we are going. So when the slaves decided to run away from their enslavement, what they had to do is they usually left in the night. You looked for the North Star and you ran, walked, swam towards that North Star. That was the direction you were taken. You did not stand still. If you stood still, you were still in bondage. To get to freedom, you had to move towards that goal. So that's the idea of the North Star here. So what he says it would do was guide future generations to have a representative government. That means everybody gets represented. Equality, freedom. The other document I'd like to share is written by the Dean of Berkeley University. That's a Californian university. It's one of the top 4 global universities, top 4 in the world, next to Harvard and Stanford. And this is the Dean. His name is Erwin Chemerinsky, and he's quite a knowledgeable man. I'll just share screen again. And in this document, this is from the Berkeley News, he's being interviewed by one of the paper's editors there. He's written many books on the Constitution. He is a liberal American legal scholar known for his studies in constitutional law. So it's not a long document, and I think it'd be well worth reading through. So this was written in 2019, September 2019, so 3 years ago. Constitution's biggest flaw, protecting slavery. So he gets asked, what are the core values of the US Constitution? The core values of the Constitution can be found in the Preamble, which is too often overlooked. It states, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, because the union before wasn't all that perfect, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defence, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The Preamble describes the core values that the Constitution seeks to achieve: democratic government, effective governance, justice, and liberty. The Preamble reminds us that the Constitution is created by we, the people. The people are sovereign. Now, why is it created by we, the people? Because it had to be ratified by the states. It took that 12 months of being debated by the states and being voted by popular vote in each state. So that's why it can be called we the people. The people are sovereign. They're the ones that voted for it. This phrase makes clear that the United States is to be a democracy, not a monarchy or a theocracy or a totalitarian government, the dominant forms of government throughout the world in 1787 and before. The Preamble tells us that the Constitution exists to ensure that the national government has the authority to do everything that is part of creating a more perfect union. The Preamble states that the Constitution is meant to ensure justice and to protect liberty. Justice must include both procedural fairness in government proceedings and fair outcomes. So he makes the point here that this is, in 1787, this is new. This is changing the world. Some scholars call, they refer to BC as before the Constitution and AD as after the document. This is a huge turning point in politics in the world. There was no really democratic government. I think there was a bit of one in Switzerland at the time, and England had its parliament, but it wasn't fair representation. It was ruled by elites. There is one key value not mentioned in the Preamble: equality. What isn't in the Preamble? Equality. This omission should not be surprising for a constitution that protected and institutionalized slavery, and that protected only the rights of white men. Women, of course, were not accorded the right to vote until the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The 14th Amendment in 1868, after the Civil War, added the assurance of equal protection. So equality is not in the Constitution until the 14th Amendment, and that's what we've been learning through Elder Paminda. I believe these are the core values of the Constitution: democratic governance, effective government, justice, liberty, and equality. So he's asked, what are some of the strengths of the Constitution that have allowed it to survive the test of time? The Constitution was intentionally written in broad, open-textured language. It leaves it to each generation to give meaning to these words. It is and was meant to be a living document. There is no other way that it could have survived the test of time. It was written in 1787 for an agrarian slave society, and it is used to govern our digital world of the 21st century. Long ago, in 1819, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote in McCulloch versus Maryland that we must never forget that it is a constitution we are expounding, one that is meant to be adapted and endure for generations to come. The Constitution also has stood the test of time because of its core values. It protects democratic governance, ensuring regular elections of those who hold most key offices. It creates a structure of government that provides checks and balances, such as the separation of powers at the federal level and the division of powers between the federal government and the states. And he goes on to talk about that. It promises equal protection in the law. We'll scroll down. What are some of the Constitution's biggest flaws, and how have those flaws manifested themselves? The Constitution's biggest flaw was in protecting the institution of slavery. Many constitutional provisions did this. Article 1, Section 9 prohibits Congress from banning the importation of slaves until 1808. And Article 5 prohibited this from being amended. Article 1, Section 2 provides that for purposes of representation in Congress, enslaved Black people in a state would be counted as 3/5 of the number of white inhabitants of that state. Article 4, Section 2 contains the Fugitive Slave Clause. I didn't mention that, but there's a Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, which required that an escaped slave be returned to his or her owner. Ultimately, it took a civil war and constitutional amendments to eliminate slavery. But racial inequalities that can be traced back to slavery have existed throughout American history and persist today. The Constitution also is flawed in not being true to its democratic premises. The Electoral College means that candidates who lose the popular vote can be elected President of the United States. So he'll go on there to explain how it's not truly democratic. So that's something that has to be improved as well. So women didn't get the vote until 1818, 1819, etc. And then, yes, this Electoral College means that it really isn't truly democratic. And now he's just going to talk about the reading of the Constitution. I'll share this link if you want to read it in its entirety. The simplistic answer is that progressives believe in a living constitution, while conservatives believe that the meaning of a constitutional provision is fixed when it is adopted and can be changed only by amendment. The late Justice Antonin Scalia, a conservative, was fond of saying that the Constitution is dead, dead, dead. These views have been given labels. The conservative view is termed originalism and believes that constitutional interpretation must follow the original understanding of a provision until it is amended. The progressive view is non-originalism and believes that the Constitution can evolve through interpretation as well as amendment. And I just want to read this next paragraph. This is overly simplistic because at times both conservatives and progressives justify their position in terms of the intent of the framers of the Constitution. And both conservatives and liberals often ignore the original understanding. The same Congress that ratified the 14th Amendment also segregated District of Columbia schools. That would make Brown versus Board of Education wrongly decided. In fact, that Congress also adopted race-conscious programs that today would be called affirmative action. Yet conservatives who oppose affirmative action abandon their originalism in arguing that such programs are unconstitutional. So what's he saying? Both sides, North, South, liberal, conservative, try and use the Constitution for their own means and can both get it wrong at times. The real difference between conservative and progressive is in their substantive values. Progressives favour separation of church and state. Conservatives reject this and want to interpret the First Amendment to allow more religious involvement in government and government support for religion. Conservatives want to create exceptions to general laws, such as anti-discrimination laws, to protect religious beliefs, and liberals reject this. Conservatives want to provide more protection for corporations, such as is in their ability to spend money in election campaigns. Liberals reject this. Progressives want to protect rights not enumerated in the Constitution, such as reproductive freedom for women. Conservatives reject this. Progressives seek greater equality, such as for gays and lesbians, including a right to marriage equality. Conservatives reject this. Conservatives interpret the Second Amendment to protect a right of people to have guns in their homes and on their persons. Liberals see the Second Amendment as being only a right to have a gun for militia services. Progressives seek to expand protections for criminal defendants under the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. Conservatives seek to narrow these protections and to give more authority to law enforcement. Progressives see the death penalty as inherently cruel and unusual punishment that violates the 8th Amendment, while conservatives believe that the death penalty is constitutional. These are the disagreements that lead to 5-4 decisions on the court, and that explains the differences in approaches to constitutional interpretation between Liberals and Conservatives. And then he's going to go into the remedy of what you do when a government official violates their power. And he'll talk about vetoes and the right to what do you call that when you impeach, an impeachment. So we won't read any further, but I'll share that argument, that article. So the Constitution, not perfect. It was to be their North Star. It was to lead to greater freedom. And yet, starting here in 1798, this is where that ship is meant to go, but it goes off course at a particular time. And that's what we'll be looking at next time. We're going to start with Henry Clay. He had good ideals when he started. And then by the time we get to this history, he's developed compromise into an art form, and the United States will slip into civil war. Okay, so any questions before we close off? So just in summary, we looked at our line and the line of the two Omega lines, our line and the line of the Omega of ancient Israel. And we saw that we need to understand internal and external events in those histories. But when we came to Millerite history, we saw that there is a difference in that there are not two calls to the church. And so that affects how we draw our line, and we take the first group through to the Sunday law, whereas in our line ends at Panium, which is prior to the Sunday law. And what we've learned over the last 18 months, 12, 18 months, is that the external events of Millerite history are very important. As we head towards our Sunday law, we need to be able to understand how they were led into their Sunday law and what were the major flaws that in their beliefs that got them to that stage, what was being preached and what was being taught, what was the political atmosphere in this time. So all we've done today is we've looked at from 1776 to 1798 on the forming of the US government, and now we want to jump in the ship and see what happens next. So that'll be our next port of call. So on that note, we might close with prayer, and I'll ask you all to kneel. Our loving God in heaven, we thank you that you have set us a North Star, that we have a goal that you have shown us and led us, and that we know that you are taking us in the right direction. We pray that we would understand the issues of these times, that we can rightly identify what is happening in our history. We pray that we would understand the difference of what makes compromise good and what makes compromise bad, that many today, Lord, even within the movement, are misunderstanding what freedom is and what is being required of them. So we pray that we would understand these issues as much as humanly possible, that when the great test that will decide our eternal destiny is before us, we will know which stream to stay on. And so, Lord, be with us now as we break and we pray for our next presentation. And we thank you that we've been together for these 12 months Zooming, and we just thank you that you've made this possible. And we pray in Jesus' name, amen.